A name is not a thing you can buy. Please, just the boy. You don't need me. The wind offered the only reply, whipping dust across the auction platform and stinging the woman's chapped face. It was a mean, scouring wind, the kind that promised a hard winter and cared little for the affairs of men, let alone the sale of them. The crowd shifted, a collection of dusty hats and weary expressions, their faces hardened by sun and indifference. They were here for livestock, for wagons, for the remnants of failed lives sold by the pound. The woman and the small boy beside her were just another lot number. Alara stood straight, a ramrod of dignity in a threadbare dress, but her hands, hidden in the folds of her skirt, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. Her son, Samuel, maybe 5 years old, pressed against her leg, his face buried in the coarse fabric. He did not cry. He had learned long ago that tears were a currency with no value. They were a tableau of silent desperation, a stark painting against the vast, pale canvas of the plains. This was the end of the line, and the line had unraveled in a place called Redemption, a town that had long forgotten the meaning of its own name. A man named Sterling, whose wealth was announced by the clean shine on his boots and the soft leather of his coat, stepped forward with his daughter. The girl, a porcelain doll with ribbons in her hair, pointed a gloved finger. "Can we buy that boy, Daddy?" she asked, her voice a clear, cruel bell in the dusty air. "He could polish my shoes." The gunslinger looked at the boy and froze. Silas had not come to Redemption for this. He had come for supplies, for solitude, for the familiar burn of cheap whiskey that quieted the ghosts. He stood at the edge of the crowd, a tall, gaunt figure wrapped in a long gray duster, his face a landscape of shadows beneath the brim of his hat. He was a man made of stillness and silence, an observer by trade and by nature. But the girl's words, so casually cruel, had struck a place in him he thought long dead. He saw the boy flinch, a tremor that ran up through the woman's rigid frame. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, a denial of this final, unbearable humiliation. He didn't see a boy for sale. He saw a small hand, clutching a worn wooden soldier. He heard a cough, thin and weak in the dead of night. He felt the phantom weight of a small body, gone cold in his arms. The memory was a shard of glass in his gut, twisting. It was old, but it had never lost its edge. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like gravel, cleared his throat. "We have a matched pair here. A strong woman, good for field or housework, and the boy, healthy. We'll start the bidding for the indenture, 2 years' service, at $20. Silence. $20 was a month's wages for some, a fortune for others. It was the price of 2 human lives for a time. Sterling raised a casual hand. 20. The auctioneer's eyes scanned the crowd. $20 from Mr. Sterling. Do I hear 25? The wind howled. Alara closed her eyes, a single, slow tear finally escaping to trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was over. She would lose him. They would take her son and teach him to kneel, and a part of her would die that was more vital than her own heart. A voice, low and rough as unplanned, would cut through the wind. 50. Every head turned. Silas had not moved, but the word had come from him. It hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Sterling's face tightened, his pride stung. He had expected no competition for this pitiful scrap of humanity. He looked Silas up and down, taking in the worn duster, the scuffed boots, the hand that rested near the butt of a Colt peacemaker. He saw a drifter, a man with nothing but the clothes on his back and the gun on his hip. 75, Sterling snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. 100, Silas said, his gaze fixed not on Sterling, but on the small boy who was now peeking out from behind his mother's skirt. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. In the boy's wide, frightened gaze, Silas saw the ghost he was trying to outrun. A murmur went through the crowd. $100 was an absurd sum. It was the price of a good horse, of a small plot of land. It was not the price of a woman and a child. Sterling's face flushed a dark, angry red. This was no longer a transaction. It was a challenge, a public contest of will. He would not be outbid by a nameless vagrant. 150, he declared, his voice rising. Silas did not hesitate. He did not look at his coin purse. He did not consider the long, hungry winter ahead. He simply spoke the next word as if it were the only one left in the world. 200. The words fell like stones into a deep well. The silence that followed was profound. Sterling stared, his mouth slightly agape. He could go higher, of course. $200 was nothing to him. But he saw the look in the gunslinger's eyes. It was not the look of a man bidding at an auction. It was the look of a man who had already paid a much higher price for something, and would not lose it again. There was a finality in that gaze that money could not challenge. Sterling gave a short, disgusted shake of his head and turned away, pulling his daughter with him. "Sold," the auctioneer said, his voice laced with disbelief, "to the stranger, for $200. Silas stepped forward, the crowd parting before him as if he were a phantom. He walked to the auctioneer's table and emptied a worn leather pouch. Gold and silver coins, the sum of months of work, bounty hunting, and lonely living, spilled onto the wood. It was almost everything he had. He didn't count it. He just pushed it forward. Then he turned to the woman. Alara was staring at him, her face a mask of shock, suspicion, and a terrifying, fragile flicker of hope. She did not understand. No one did this. No one paid a fortune for nothing. He did not speak to her. He knelt, slowly, so as not to frighten the boy. He was now eye level with Samuel. The child watched him, his small body tense. Silas said nothing. He simply held out his hand, palm up. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, but it was steady. It was an offering, an invitation, promise. After a long moment, a tiny, dirt-smudged hand crept out from the folds of the dress and hesitantly, carefully, placed itself in his. Silas's fingers closed gently around it. He stood, still holding the boy's hand, and looked at Alara. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "Come on." He turned and walked away from the platform, leading the boy. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He knew she would. For her son, she would walk into fire. For her son, she would follow a stranger into the unknown. The wind blew at their backs, pushing them away from the town, away from the life that had almost been, toward a future as vast and uncertain as the plains stretching before them. A journey had begun, not of miles, but of the heart. A quiet redemption, bought for $200 and the memory of a ghost. The ride to his cabin was a study in silence. The wagon creaked, the horse snorted, and the vast, empty land swallowed all other sound. Silas sat at the reins, his shoulders a rigid line against the horizon. Alara and Samuel huddled in the back, tucked beneath a rough wool blanket he had tossed them without a word. Alara held her son tight, feeling the small, steady beat of his heart against her ribs. It was the only thing in the world that felt real. She watched the man's back. He was a puzzle of contradictions. The shocking generosity at the auction, followed by this impenetrable silence. The gentle way he had taken her son's hand, contrasted with the deadly weight of the gun at his hip. Fear was a familiar companion, but this was a new strain of it. A fear laced with a bewildering sense of obligation. He had bought them. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Whatever his reasons, they were now his responsibility, his property, until a debt she could never repay was settled. The landscape grew wilder, the dirt track dwindling to a faint suggestion on the prairie. They climbed into low, rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. The air grew cooler, cleaner. After what felt like hours, he guided the horse into a small, hidden valley, a bowl of green cupped in the palm of the rocky hills. A thin ribbon of smoke curled into the sky from the stone chimney of a small, solid-looking cabin. It was utterly isolated. No other homes were visible, no sign of life but for the cabin and a small, sturdy barn. For a moment, the isolation terrified her. No one would hear her scream, but as she looked closer, she saw a kind of peace in it, too. It was a place where the cruel judgments of a town like Redemption could not reach. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt and dismounted. He moved with an economy of motion, unhitching the horse with practiced ease. He still had not spoken. He led the horse to the barn, leaving Alara and Samuel sitting in the wagon. 2 pieces of luggage he had not yet decided where to place. Alara took a deep breath. She could run. While he was in the barn, she could take her son and flee into the hills. But where would they go? The wilderness would kill them as surely as any man. Winter was coming, its breath already sharp on the wind, and he had not harmed them. He had not even looked at her with the possessive gaze she had seen in so many other men's eyes. He simply was. When he returned from the barn, he stopped by the wagon and looked up at her. His face was unreadable, shadowed by his hat. "There's food inside," he said. "The well's out back." Then he walked away, heading toward the trees at the edge of the clearing, an axe resting on his shoulder. He began to chop wood, the rhythmic thump-crack of the axe a steady, percussive beat against the silence. It was a sound of work, of life, of normalcy. It was not the sound of a threat. Slowly, stiffly, Alara climbed down from the wagon. She lifted Samuel into her arms, though he was getting too big to be carried, and held him close as she approached the cabin door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was as sparse and silent as the man himself. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace. A narrow bed was built into one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a few shelves held a small collection of tins, a sack of flour, and a handful of iron pots. It was meticulously clean. A worn coat hung from a peg by the door. A rifle rested on brackets above the mantelpiece. It was a space built for solitude, not for a family. She found a pot of stew, still warm, on the hearth. There were 2 tin plates and a small, slightly misshapen loaf of bread on the table. He had prepared for them. The thought was unsettling. This was not the impulsive act of a moment. It was a decision. She served the stew, her movements cautious, as if she were a guest in a stranger's house, which was exactly what she was. Samuel ate hungrily, his eyes darting around the small room, taking in every detail. Alara ate slowly, her own hunger a distant knot in her stomach. Every sound from outside, the sharp ring of the axe, the call of a crow, made her start. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, Silas returned. He carried an armload of split logs, which he stacked neatly by the hearth. He did not look at them. He moved to a small basin in the corner and washed his hands and face, the splashing water loud in the quiet room. He took the remaining stew and the last of the bread and ate standing by the counter, his back to them. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Alara knew she should say something. "Thank you. What do you want from us? What are the rules?" But the words wouldn't form. They were trapped behind a wall of fear and pride. When he was finished, he rinsed his plate and set it aside. He looked at the narrow bed, then at her and the boy who was now asleep in her lap. A flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, crossed his face before the mask of indifference settled back into place. He took the wool blanket from the wagon and laid it on the floor in the corner farthest from the bed, creating a small, makeshift pallet. He gestured toward it. "You can sleep there." It was not an order, but a statement. He was giving them their own space, as much as this small room would allow. He banked the fire for the night, the embers glowing like watchful eyes in the darkness. Then he took off his gun belt, hanging it on a peg next to his coat, and lay down on the narrow bed, turning his face to the wall. Within minutes, the sound of his slow, steady breathing filled the room. He was asleep. Alara carried her son to the pallet of blankets. She lay down beside him, pulling him into the curve of her body. She did not sleep. For hours, she lay awake in the unfamiliar darkness, listening to the breathing of the stranger on the other side of the room. He had saved them from one kind of prison, but she could not yet tell if he had simply delivered them to another. The cabin was a shelter, but it was not yet a sanctuary. And trust was a seed that could not grow in such barren, silent soil. She stayed awake, guarding her son, waiting for a dawn she could not be sure would bring any light. The days settled into a rhythm, marked not by conversation, but by chores. The sun rose and Silas would already be gone, tending to his horse or checking a line of traps he had set in the hills. He would leave a stack of firewood by the door and a fresh bucket of water from the well. Alara would rise, build up the fire, and cook a simple breakfast of oatmeal or fried dough. They would eat at the same table, but at different times, two ships passing in the small sea of the cabin. She cleaned. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few dishes, and mended the small tears in Samuel's clothes. She found a worn shirt of Silas's with a ripped seam and, after a moment's hesitation, mended it too, leaving it folded neatly on his bed. He never mentioned it, but the next day, she found a small sack of dried apples on the table, a luxury she hadn't tasted in years. It was their language, a silent exchange of labor and provision. Trust did not come, but a routine formed, and in its predictability there was a fragile kind of safety. She learned the sounds of his life, the soft jingle of his spurs as he walked, the low murmur he used to soothe his horse, the steady scrape of a knife sharpening a blade by the firelight. He was a man of immense quiet and control. His movements were precise, his needs simple. He never raised his voice. He never made a sudden move that might startle her or the boy. Samuel remained a ghost in their midst. He played silently in the corner with a few smooth stones he had found by the creek. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a whisper. He watched Silas with wide, wary eyes, a small animal assessing a predator. If Silas entered the cabin, Samuel would retreat to his mother's side, a silent, magnetic pull. Silas, for his part, seemed to make a deliberate effort to ignore the boy. He never spoke to him, never looked at him for more than a passing moment. It was not a cruel indifference, Alara began to realize, but a cautious one. It was as if he were afraid of breaking something so fragile just by looking at it. He gave the boy space, a wide berth of silence and distance that was almost as loud as a shout. One afternoon, while Silas was out, Alara decided to organize the shelves. Tucked away behind a tin of coffee, she found a small, carved wooden object wrapped in a piece of oilcloth. Curious, she unwrapped it. It was a bird, a hawk or an eagle, its wings half spread, its head cocked as if listening. The detail was extraordinary. Every feather was etched into the dark wood. The talons were sharp. The eyes seemed impossibly alive. It was the work of a patient, skilled hand. It was a work of art, a thing of beauty in a life stripped down to bare survival. She couldn't reconcile the man who carried a gun with the man who could carve something so delicate. She wrapped it carefully and put it back, feeling as though she had trespassed on a secret, sacred place. The secret gestures continued. One morning, a length of soft blue calico fabric appeared on the porch. No note, no word, just the fabric. It was enough to make a new shirt for Samuel. Her eyes filled with tears as she touched it. It was the first new thing her son would have in over a year. She worked on it for days, her needle flying, pouring all her unspoken gratitude into the tiny, even stitches. When the shirt was finished, she dressed Samuel in it. The bright blue made his eyes seem wider, his face less pale. He touched the soft material in wonder. That evening, when Silas came in for supper, he glanced at the boy. His eyes rested on the new shirt for a single, long moment. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Then he looked away, but not before Alara saw it. A deep, profound sadness in his eyes. A pain so old and deep it seemed to be a part of his very bones. The first snow fell in late October, a light dusting that melted by noon but served as a warning. The world was shrinking, the days growing shorter, the nights colder. The cabin, once a stranger's dwelling, was becoming their entire world. The silence within its walls began to change. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers, but the quieter, more companionable silence of people who have learned the contours of each other's presence. They knew when to move aside, when to be still. One night, a wolf howled, its voice a lonely, mournful cry from the ridge above the valley. Samuel, asleep on his pallet, whimpered and stirred. Alara went to him, stroking his hair. From across the room, Silas spoke, his voice a low rumble in the darkness. "It's a long way off. It won't come down here." It was the first time he had offered her reassurance. It was a small thing, a simple statement of fact, but it felt like a tether thrown across a chasm. "Thank you," she whispered into the dark. He did not reply, but a few minutes later, she heard the soft scrape of wood as he added another log to the fire, a silent promise to keep the darkness and the cold at bay. She lay beside her son, listening to the crackle of the flames, and for the first time since she had arrived in this strange, quiet place, she felt a flicker of something that was not fear. It was not yet peace, but it was close. It was the quiet acknowledgement that they were not alone. They were three solitary souls, weathering the same storm under the same roof. And perhaps that was enough. Samuel remained the quiet center of their small universe, a planet held in orbit by the gravity of two silent suns. He had the new blue shirt, but he had no toys, no small treasures a boy could hold in his pocket and call his own. His only companions were the smooth stones he arranged and rearranged on the hearth. Silas watched him more than he let on. He would see the boy tracing patterns in the dust, his small face a mask of concentration, and the familiar ache would twist inside him. A boy needed more than stones. A boy needed something to guard, something to imagine with. One evening, after Alara and Samuel were asleep, Silas sat by the fire, not cleaning his gun or mending his gear, but holding a block of pine wood and a small, sharp knife. The firelight danced across his face, softening the hard lines, revealing the deep furrows of concentration on his brow. He worked slowly with an ingrained patience. Shaving by shaving, the block of wood began to take on a new shape. A head, a neck, a flowing mane. He worked late into the night, the only sounds the soft scrape of the blade and the pop and hiss of the fire. The ghosts were quiet tonight, held at bay by the simple, focused work of his hands. He was not just carving wood. He was carving out a piece of his own locked-away soul. He was creating a horse. It was small enough to fit in a child's hand, but it was full of life. He carved the legs tensed for a gallop, the tail streaming behind it, the ears pricked forward. He sanded it smooth with a piece of rough leather until the wood felt warm and alive to the touch. He didn't know why he was doing it. It was an impulse, a need, a silent apology to a memory. When it was finished, he held it in his palm. It was a good horse, a strong horse. It was the kind of thing a father would make for his son. The thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. He closed his hand around the small carving, his knuckles white. He was not a father. He was a man who had failed at being one. He almost threw it in the fire. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture that meant nothing. But he couldn't. He looked over at the sleeping boy, a small, still shape under the blanket. In the dim light, he could almost be. Silas shook his head, cutting the thought short. He stood and walked to the door, opening it to the frigid night air. The stars were brilliant in the black sky, cold and impossibly distant. He stood there for a long time, the little horse clutched in his hand, the cold air doing nothing to cool the fire in his memory. Finally, he stepped onto the porch and placed the wooden horse on the railing, positioning it so it faced the door. Then he went back inside, shutting the world out, and lay down on his cot, staring into the darkness. The next morning, Alara rose first as always. She opened the door to fetch water and stopped. There, on the railing, silhouetted against the pale morning light, was the small, perfect horse. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its smooth lines. She knew instantly who had made it. It was the same hand that had carved the hawk. She looked back into the cabin at the man pretending to be asleep on his cot. A wave of emotion, so complex and overwhelming it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her. She said nothing, She went about her morning chores, the wooden horse tucked safely in her apron pocket. When Samuel woke, she knelt beside him. "I found something for you," she whispered, and held out her hand. Samuel's eyes widened. He took the horse with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. He held it in both hands, turning it over and over. He ran a finger along its back, its mane. A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. It was the first real smile she had seen from him in months. It was like the sun breaking through a long, gray winter. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. "Is he mine?" "He's yours," she said, her voice thick. All day, Samuel played with the horse. He galloped it across the floorboards, made it jump over cracks, and whispered secrets into its carved ear. The cabin was filled with the soft sounds of a child's imagination, a music it had never known. Silas watched from the corners of his eyes. He watched the boy's face, alive with a joy that was both beautiful and painful to behold. He felt Alara's gaze on him, too. It was different now. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a deep, searching curiosity. She was looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time. She was trying to piece together the man who saved them, the man who carried a gun, and the man who carved toys in the dead of night. That afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, ugly gray. The wind began to moan through the pines, a low, mournful sound that promised a storm. Silas came in from the barn, his face grim. "It's going to be a bad one," he said, his first unsolicited words of the day. "Bring in all the firewood you can carry." They worked together wordlessly, stacking wood inside the cabin until one wall was lined with it. They secured the barn door, checked on the horse. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. As the first snowflakes, hard and sharp as pellets of ice, began to fall, they shut the cabin door, sealing themselves in against the coming fury. The storm was brewing outside, but inside, another kind of storm, one of quiet emotion and unspoken history, was about to break. The storm hit with the fury of a cornered animal. The wind shrieked, clawing at the little cabin, trying to find a way in. Snow came down not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, erasing the world. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a lone bastion of warmth and light against the raging dark. The cabin, which had once felt so isolated, now felt like the only solid thing in a world torn apart by chaos. It was in the heart of this maelstrom that Samuel began to cough. At first, it was small and dry, but it quickly deepened, a ragged, wet sound that tore at Alara's heart. She felt his forehead. It was burning. His cheeks were flushed with a feverish heat, and his eyes were glassy. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. They were miles from any town, from any doctor. They were trapped. "He's sick," she said, her voice tight with fear. She looked at Silas, her eyes pleading. "The fever's come on him." Silas moved immediately. The quiet, distant man was gone, replaced by someone calm, focused, and competent. "Get him out of his clothes and wrap him in a dry blanket. Put a kettle on the fire. We need to get his fever down." His commands were gentle but firm, leaving no room for argument. Alara did as she was told, her hands trembling as she undressed her son. Samuel was listless, his small body limp with sickness. Silas went to a small wooden chest in the corner, one Alara had never seen him open. He took out a leather pouch and from it, an assortment of dried herbs. He crushed them in his palm, the faint, medicinal scent filling the air. "Willow bark," he said, answering her unasked question. "For the fever. And yarrow. It'll make him sweat it out." He knew things a gunslinger had no business knowing. He steeped the herbs in hot water, creating a bitter-smelling tea. He knelt by the pallet where Alara held her son. "We need to get him to drink this." Samuel whimpered, turning his head away. "It's all right, son," Silas said, his voice softer than Alara had ever heard it. He dipped a corner of a clean cloth in the tea and gently squeezed a few drops into the boy's mouth. He did it again and again with infinite patience until a small amount of the medicine was down. All night they fought the fever. The storm raged outside, its fury a mirror to the battle being waged inside the small cabin. Silas never left the boy's side. He bathed Samuel's forehead with cool cloths. He spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur, telling him stories of stars and eagles and brave horses. He seemed to know instinctively what was needed, when to add another log to the fire, when to offer a sip of water, when to just sit and wait. Alara watched him, her own exhaustion a distant hum. She saw not a hardened drifter, but a man who had done this before. The gentleness in his large, rough hands, the deep, weary knowledge in his eyes. It all spoke of a past he kept locked away. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, as he was changing a cloth on Samuel's brow, she saw a tear trace a path down his weathered cheek. He wiped it away quickly, angrily, as if ashamed of the betrayal. A memory surfaced in him, sharp and unwanted. Another fever, another small body burning in his arms. His wife, Maria, her face pale with fear, praying in a language he only half understood. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, the uselessness of his gun, of his strength. He remembered the silence that came after the last, shuddering breath. The memory was a wound that had never healed, and tending to Samuel was like pressing a thumb into the raw, scarred flesh of it. He was not just fighting for this boy's life. He was fighting the ghost of the son he had lost. Toward dawn, the storm began to lose its strength. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh, and inside the fever broke. The heat receded from Samuel's skin, leaving him pale and drenched in sweat, but cool to the touch. His breathing eased, deepening into the slow, steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. The crisis had passed. Alara sagged with relief, the tension draining out of her so completely she felt she might collapse. She looked at Silas, who was still kneeling by the boy, his shoulders slumped. His face, in the gray morning light filtering through the window, was etched with a profound exhaustion that was more than just a sleepless night. "He's going to be all right," Silas said, his voice raspy. Alara could not speak. She simply nodded, tears of gratitude and relief streaming down her face. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. It was thanks. It was acknowledgement. It was a bridge across the silence. He did not pull away. He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. For a long moment, they stayed like that, two survivors in the quiet aftermath of a storm, bound by the shared vigil over a small, precious life. The world outside was buried in snow, silent and still, and inside the cabin, the walls of suspicion and fear had finally, irrevocably, come down. The world was born anew, white and silent. The snow was waist-deep, muffling all sound, isolating their small valley completely. For 3 days they were marooned in a sea of white. The storm had passed, leaving a profound and cleansing peace in its wake. Samuel slept, his body slowly knitting itself back together. His fever was gone, leaving him weak but on the mend. In the quiet of those days, something shifted between Alara and Silas. The long, tense silences were replaced by a comfortable quiet. They moved around the small cabin with a new, unspoken understanding. The shared crisis had burned away the distrust, leaving behind the raw, fragile foundations of a bond. On the first morning after the storm, Alara rose early and made coffee. She poured it into 2 tin cups. She took one to Silas, who was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, looking as if he hadn't slept at all. She held it out to him. He looked at the cup, then at her. He took it. "Thank you," he said. "It is I who should be thanking you," she replied, her voice soft but clear. "You saved him." He just shook his head slightly, as if to dismiss her words, and took a long drink of the coffee. He was not a man who knew how to accept gratitude. They sat in silence for a while, watching the flames. The little wooden horse was on the mantelpiece, where Silas had placed it. "We lost our farm," Elara said suddenly, the words spilling into the quiet. "After my husband, Thomas, died of the lung sickness. The banker, Mr. Sterling, he held the note. He took everything. Said we still owed him. That's how we ended up in redemption." She spoke in a low monotone, recounting the facts without emotion, as if telling someone else's story, but her hands, wrapped around her cup, were trembling. Silas listened, his gaze never leaving the fire. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, his voice a low rasp, "This world takes things." He reached up and touched the smooth wooden stock of the rifle above the mantel. His fingers traced the familiar lines. "It takes and it takes. And sometimes you're the one doing the taking." It was not a confession, but it was close. It was a glimpse into the darkness he carried, a hint of the guilt that drove his solitude. He had a wife once, Maria, and a son, Mateo. They were ghosts that lived in the silence with him. A fever had taken his son, and a bullet, fired from his own gun in a moment of stupid, prideful violence in a saloon, had started a chain of events that cost him his wife, his home, his name. He had been running from that bullet ever since. He didn't tell her all of this. He couldn't. The words were buried too deep, under too many years of regret. But he gave her a piece of it. "I had a son once," he said, the words costing him more than all the gold he'd paid at the auction. He was about Samuel's age. Elara's heart ached for him. She finally understood the look in his eyes when he watched her boy. She understood the carved horse, the gentleness, the deep, abiding sadness. They were both haunted. They had both lost everything. In that shared landscape of grief, they found a small patch of common ground. When the snow finally melted enough for travel, they knew they would have to go to town for supplies. The flour was low, the salt nearly gone. A week after the storm, Silas hitched the horse to the wagon. The thought of returning to redemption filled Elara with a cold dread, but she knew it was necessary. Samuel was well enough to travel, bundled in every blanket they owned. As they prepared to leave, Elara went to Silas. She held out the small, carved hawk she had found on the shelf. "You should take this with you," she said. "For luck." He looked at the hawk in her hand, the secret thing she was not supposed to have seen. He didn't ask how she found it. He simply took it, his fingers brushing hers, and slipped it into the pocket of his duster. It was an acceptance, an agreement. They were in this together now. The trip to town was different. Samuel, chattering about the snow-covered trees, sat between them on the wagon seat. The silence was no longer a wall, but a shared space. They were not a man, a woman, and a child. They were, for this small moment in time, starting to feel like something else. Something that might one day be called a family. But the world outside their valley was not as peaceful as the one within it, and the man who had tried to buy her son had a long and bitter memory. Redemption was just as dusty and grim as they had left it. The townspeople stared as their wagon rolled down the main street. Whispers followed them like a cloud of flies. The sight of the woman and child, bought and paid for by the silent gunslinger, was the most interesting piece of gossip they'd had in months. Silas ignored them, his face a mask of stone. He pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. "Stay here," he said to Elara, his voice low. "I'll be quick." But he wasn't quick enough. As he disappeared into the store, a familiar figure emerged from the saloon across the street. It was Sterling, flanked by two rough-looking men who worked for him. His face, when he saw Elara and Samuel in the wagon, twisted into a smug, cruel smile. He strode toward them, his shiny boots kicking up dust. "Well, well," Sterling said, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "Look what the cat dragged in. Enjoying your new accommodations?" He leered at Elara, his eyes raking over her with an insulting familiarity. "I imagine his cabin is a step up from the auction block, at least." Elara's face went pale, but she held her chin high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her fear. She pulled Samuel closer to her. Sterling's gaze shifted to the boy. The indenture papers are filed with the magistrate, you know? He said, his voice turning oily and false. A legal document. 2 years of service. That boy is, by law, my property to command. He took a step closer, reaching a hand toward the wagon. I believe I have some shoes that need polishing. Samuel whimpered and buried his face in his mother's side. Alara's arm tightened around him like a band of steel. You will not touch him, she said, her voice shaking but full of a fierce, protective fire. At that moment, the door to the general store opened and Silas stepped out, a sack of flour on his shoulder. He took in the scene in an instant. Sterling, his men, Alara's terror, the boy's fear. He dropped the sack with a heavy thud and moved toward the wagon. His steps slow, deliberate, and utterly silent. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to make Sterling's men shift uncomfortably. Silas stopped, placing himself directly between Sterling and the wagon. He was taller than Sterling, his frame lean but hard. He was a shadow, and Sterling was just a man puffed up with money and pride. There's a misunderstanding, Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. The papers were voided. A new contract was filed. Sterling scoffed. What are you talking about? I saw no new contract. Silas looked past Sterling, his gaze sweeping over the curious faces that had gathered to watch the confrontation. He looked at the town marshal, who was now cautiously approaching. Then he looked directly at Alara, a silent question in his eyes. She met his gaze, her own eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a desperate, burgeoning trust. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all he needed. He turned his gaze back to Sterling. His voice was not loud, but it carried down the entire street, clear and absolute, a declaration that would change everything. The papers were burned, he said. She is my wife. The boy is my son. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The lie was so bold, so audacious, it stunned everyone into silence. Sterling stared, his jaw slack. The marshal stopped in his tracks. Silas did not waver. He held Sterling's gaze, his own eyes like chips of flint. He was daring him to call his bluff. He was daring anyone to question his word. In this town, in this time, a man's word, backed by the reputation that clung to him like dust, was a powerful thing. And Silas's reputation, unspoken but deeply felt, was that of a man you did not cross. This is my family, he said again, the words sealing the lie into a kind of truth. He turned his back on Sterling, the ultimate insult, and stepped up onto the wagon seat. He took the reins. He didn't look at Alara or Samuel. He just looked ahead. Get your men out of my way, he said to Sterling, his voice flat. Sterling, sputtering, his face purple with rage and public humiliation, was at a loss. He could push, he could fight, but he knew, looking at the cold finality in the gunslinger's back, that it was a fight he would not win. He motioned furiously for his men to step aside. Silas clucked to the horse, and the wagon rolled forward, parting the stunned crowd. They rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the stares behind them. They rode out of redemption, a place that had offered them none, and headed back toward the only home they had, a place where a lie spoken to protect the innocent had just laid the cornerstone of a new and unexpected truth. The journey back to the valley was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the comfortable quiet of companions. It was a momentous silence, heavy with the weight of the words spoken in the street. She is my wife. The boy is my son. The declaration hung in the air between them, as real and solid as the sack of flour in the back of the wagon. It was a lie, a shield he had raised to protect them, but it had felt, for a dizzying moment, like a vow. Alara stole glances at his profile. His face was set, his eyes on the trail ahead. He looked no different than he had that morning, yet everything had changed. He had claimed them. In front of the entire town, he had bound their lives to his with 3 simple, untrue sentences. She should have been afraid, trapped by this new public fiction. Instead, A feeling of profound, bone-deep security settled over her for the first time in years. Someone had stood for her. Someone had stood for her son. When they arrived back at the cabin, the lie followed them inside. It settled in the chairs by the fire. It lay on the blankets of their beds. They moved around it, acutely aware of its presence. Silas unhitched the horse and put the supplies away. Alara started a fire and began to prepare a meal. Samuel, seemingly oblivious to the adult tension, took out his wooden horse and began to play on the floor. Neither of them spoke of what had happened. There were no words for it. To acknowledge the lie would be to dismantle the protection it offered. To accept it as truth was a step neither was ready to take. So they let the action speak instead. The next morning, Silas didn't go out to his trap lines. Instead, he took his axe and went into the woods, returning with 2 straight, sturdy pine logs. He spent the day on the porch, sawing and shaping the wood. He was building something. Alara watched him from the window as she kneaded bread. He worked with the same quiet intensity he applied to everything, his hands sure and steady. By evening, the shape had become clear. He was building a bed frame, a small one, a child's bed. He brought it inside and assembled it in the corner where Samuel's pallet had been. He filled a sack with fresh, dry straw for a mattress. He had made a proper bed for his son. He said nothing about it. He simply did it. The next day, while Silas was out hunting, Alara took a spade from the barn and went to a small, sunny patch of earth near the cabin. The ground was hard, but she worked until her back ached and her hands were raw, turning the soil. She was preparing a garden for the spring. She had found a small packet of vegetable seeds tucked away in the back of a crate in the barn. She was planting roots. She was tending the soil of their new life, her home. Samuel, emboldened by the new sense of safety that had settled over the cabin, grew louder. His whispers turned into speech. His silent play was now accompanied by the sounds of galloping hooves and shouted commands to his wooden horse. One afternoon, he approached Silas, who was sitting on the porch cleaning his rifle. He held out the horse. "He's thirsty," Samuel said, his voice small but clear. Silas froze, his hands stilling on the rifle. He looked at the boy, then at the horse. For a long moment he didn't move. Alara watched from the doorway, her heart in her throat. Then, slowly, Silas put down his rifle. He took the little horse from Samuel's hand. He stood up, walked to the water barrel, and solemnly dipped the horse's nose into the water. "There you go," he said, his voice a low gravel. He handed the horse back to Samuel. A huge smile broke across the boy's face. "Thank you," he said. From that day on, the dam of silence between them was broken. Samuel would follow Silas around, chattering, asking questions. Silas, in turn, began to speak to him. He taught him the names of the birds. He showed him how to track a rabbit in the dirt. He taught him how to skip stones across the creek that ran through the valley. The sound of the boy's laughter, bright and clear, began to fill the small, quiet valley. It was a sound of healing. The lie spoken in town was not a lie here. In the quiet reality of their days, it was becoming true. He was the man who provided and protected. She was the woman who nurtured and cared for the home. And the boy was the heart that beat between them. They were not bound by law or by blood, but by shared hardship, by quiet acts of kindness, and by a public declaration that had taken on a life of its own. They were building a home, not with words, but with the silent, steady work of their hands and their hearts. The last of the autumn colors bled from the trees, leaving behind stark, gray branches against a steel sky. The days grew short, the nights long and cold. The rhythm of their life was now deeply ingrained, a quiet choreography of survival and nascent affection. They worked together to prepare for the coming winter, banking earth against the cabin walls for insulation, salting the meat Silas brought back from his hunts, and stacking the woodpile into a small mountain. The garden plot Alara had cleared was covered with a protective layer of leaves, sleeping until spring. Their shared work wove their lives together in 1,000 small ways. He would hold the ladder steady while she sealed a drafty spot in the roof with mud and straw. She would have a hot cup of coffee ready for him when he came in from the cold, his face raw from the wind. They moved around each other with an easy grace, no longer two strangers, but partners in the shared enterprise of living. A home is not built with nails, but with nights spent watching over a fever. It is measured not in square feet, but in the space left at the table for another person. Silas had built this cabin with his own two hands to be a fortress for his solitude, a place to hide from the world and his own ghosts. But the woman and the child had breached its walls, not with force, but with quiet need. They had filled its silence with the sound of breathing, with the scent of baking bread, with the bright, improbable sound of a child's laughter. They had turned his refuge into a home. A family is not forged by blood, but by a lie spoken in truth. It is not declared on a piece of paper, but in the unspoken promise to stand between a child and the cruelty of the world. The words Silas had spoken in redemption, my wife, my son, had been a shield, but in the quiet valley, they had become a seed. Watered by daily acts of care and warmed by the tentative heat of shared trust, that seed had taken root. One evening, deep in November, the first true blizzard of the season descended. The world outside vanished into a swirling vortex of white. Inside they were safe and warm. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. Samuel was asleep in his new bed, the wooden horse clutched in his hand. Silas sat in a rocking chair by the fire. It was an old chair, one that had been in the corner of the cabin since he'd built it, stiff and unused. But Alara had rubbed it with oil until the wood gleamed, and had made a small cushion for its seat. Now Silas sat in it every evening. The slow, creaking rhythm of the rocker was a sound of peace, a sound of permanence. He was cleaning his gun, but the action was different now. It was not the nervous habit of a man expecting trouble, but the methodical, routine maintenance of a tool. A tool he hoped he would never have to use again to protect what was inside these walls. Alara sat at the table, mending one of Samuel's shirts by the light of a kerosene lamp. She glanced over at Silas, at the way the firelight softened the hard lines of his face. She thought of the man who had frozen at the auction block, the silent stranger who had brought them here. He was still a quiet man, a man who held his past close. But he was no longer a stranger. He was the man who had carved a toy for her son, who had fought a fever in a storm, who had called them his own. She finished her mending and set the shirt aside. She picked up a worn copy of a book she had managed to keep, one of the few possessions she had left from her old life. She moved her chair closer to the fire and began to read aloud, her voice soft in the warm, quiet room. It was a story about a faraway land, about kings and queens and magical forests. Silas stopped his work. He rested the gun across his lap and leaned his head back, closing his eyes. He just listened. Outside, the wind howled its lonely song, but inside the small cabin, 3 broken souls were slowly, quietly, becoming whole. From silence had come warmth. From necessity, a bond. From a lie, a truth. The winter deepened, burying the world in a thick blanket of snow. The silence of the valley was now absolute, a peaceful, holy quiet. The days were short, the nights profoundly long, but the cabin was a bastion of warmth and light against the cold and dark. They had enough. They had food, they had shelter, and they had each other. The fears that had once haunted Alara's every waking moment, hunger, cold, the cruelty of men, had receded, replaced by the simple, grounding rhythm of their life together. Silas had changed. The haunted, restless energy that had always clung to him had settled. He still spent time alone, walking the snowy ridges above the valley, but he always came back. The cabin was no longer his prison of solitude. It was his anchor. He had started to talk about the spring, about building a lean-to on the barn for a milk cow, about clearing more land for a larger garden. He spoke of the future, something he had not dared to do for a very long time. One evening, as a gentle snow fell outside, Alara took his heavy winter coat from its peg. The lining was frayed, the seams stressed from years of hard wear. She had been working on it in secret, using a piece of an old wool blanket to create a new, warm lining. She had spent hours with her needle, her stitches small and neat, reinforcing the coat that was his armor against the world. It was an act of profound and intimate care. She finished the last stitch and held it up. It was still a worn coat, marked by the scars of a hard life, but it was stronger now, warmer. Whole. She walked to the peg by the door where he always hung it and placed it there. It was an act of permanence. This coat, and the man who wore it, belonged here. Silas was sitting in the rocking chair by the fire, watching her. He had seen what she was doing. He had watched her work on it for the past week, her head bent in concentration, her fingers moving with a quiet grace. He had said nothing. She turned from the door, her work done, and her eyes met his across the room. The firelight flickered between them. The air was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of all the days they had shared, all the trials they had weathered. There was nothing left to say. There was only this. She walked to the fire and stood before him for a moment. Then she knelt down on the hearth rug beside his chair. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out and placed her hand on his, where it rested on the arm of the chair. His hand was large, calloused, and warm from the fire. It was the hand that had saved them, the hand that had carved the horse, the hand that had held a cool cloth to her son's forehead. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. He looked down at her small hand resting on his, and then he looked into her eyes. He saw no fear there. He saw no pity. He saw strength and gratitude, and something more, something that mirrored the strange, new feeling in his own chest. Slowly, with a deliberation that felt as sacred as a prayer, he turned his hand over and covered hers, his fingers lacing through hers. The touch was a vow. It was an acceptance of all that had passed between them and all that was to come. It was the quiet, undeniable truth that had grown out of a desperate lie. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks they had made, erasing the past. There was only the present, the warm, firelit room, the sleeping child, the two hands clasped together. From the silence, a home. From the ashes,